It was in October of 2002 that I met my Gardner family from Idaho. This is the first time I had met them since I was probably a little kid. I want to tell some of the stories that I know from the James Gardner family. The first one I would like to tell is the wife of Brigham Edward Gardner, and that's Eleanor Robbins. I'd like to tell one of her ancestors, which most of you here today would have, are a direct descendant of. Stephen Hopkins is the seventh great-grandfather of my great-grandmother, Eleanor Robbins. His story is very interesting, and very many people from the United States are descendants of him. In 1609, Stephen Hopkins boarded one of three ships that were sent to Jamestown for supplies to help them during their time of struggle. Hopkins, along with other passenger crew, were stranded for 10 months when a hurricane hit them in the Atlantic. They survived on turtles, birds, and wild pigs. While stranded, Stephen and others organized a mutiny against the governor because the governor wanted to stay there on the island, and they wanted to rebuild a ship that they could still continue to get to Jamestown. When the mutiny was discovered, Stephen was sentenced to death. He pleaded with sorrows and tears and somehow managed to get his sentence commuted. Sometime later, the castaways built a small ship and sailed to Jamestown. While Hopkins was in Jamestown, his first wife passed away, leaving behind 3 children. When he heard that, he rushed back to England. While he was in England, he married Elizabeth Fisher, and they had 7 children together. They would all travel together on the Mayflower to America. Since Stephen had been to Virginia before, he was part of nearly all exploring missions and helped communicate with the Navy Americans. He served as governor assistant for many years and volunteered for the Pequot War of 1637. He opened up a shop that served alcohol, which would eventually lead to trouble for him. After getting into a fight and seriously wounded, his opponent Stephen was fined allowing drinking and shuffleboard playing on Sunday. He would also be later fined for allowing people to drink excessively, selling beer at twice the actual value, and selling a looking glass for twice what it was worth. He died in 1644. Now, what's not listed here is that Stephen Hopkins, when he was in Jamestown, the story of them getting hit by a hurricane and stranded on the Bermuda Islands, which was the first time anybody had landed on the Bermuda Islands, and they claimed it for Britain. That story reached a person in England named William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare wrote a play called The Tempest, and in The Tempest, Astophanos is to represent Stephen Hopkins and his story of the hurricaned and stranded people on the Bermuda Island. James Gardner and his wife Hannah started west with the handcarts in July. They were in the Willie Handcart Company, and this was late in the season. They had difficulties along the way, including a buffalo stampede where they lost most of the oxen and cattle. Cholera hit the company, and James was asked to bury the dead, and then he got cholera. He and another man were not able to keep up with the company, so they trailed behind, often getting into camp late at night. Hannah had to pull the handcart with the help of Mary Ann. The 2 little boys rode on the handcart, and Agnes walked. One day, Frederick found the food ration for the family and ate it all, causing the family members to have no food that day. Then, just as the food ran out of the company, the winter storms hit. Rescues from Salt Lake finally met them, but they still had to make it up Rocky Ridge. The family, all of them, arrived in Salt Lake City on November 9th, 1856. James, when he arrived in Salt Lake City, was so thin that when his brothers went to meet them, they passed him in the line and didn't recognize him. I will now begin to tell some stories of various people that are descendants of James Gardner. First one I'd like to start with is Mary Ann Gardner. His oldest daughter was going to marry John Alphonso Saunders. just shortly before they were married, but after they were engaged. Alfonso's brother came to him and explained that Saunders was not his true father. And so he told Alfonso that Jeremiah Willie, when he went just before he went to the Mormon battalion, that he was married to a Samantha Call, and he also took Alfonso's mother, Sarah Ann, as his second wife. Both of those were listed as wives on the rolls of the Mormon battalion. When he came back from the Mormon battalion, she was pretty much destitute and found somebody that could take care of her or help her. So the stories that have been handed down from the family was Willie returned home from the Mormon battalion, and he realized that Sarah had been with another man who was taking care of her, providing her food and shelter. At this time, he disowned her, burnt all records that she and her son Alfonso existed. When he heard this from his brother, Alfonso decided to change his name to Willie, which would have been his birth name. And when he asked his mother all about this, she told him it was true. So Mary Ann ends up being a Willie and not a Saunders, is what she expected. What's also interesting is on the Jeremiah Willie, he was quite a fairly important man, and he has a cabin that's out in Bountiful, and it's kind of interesting cabin. It was built, and it does help. He had it helped built by his sons, and when they built it, after they were finished, somebody eventually came to own the cabin, and they decided to build a house around it, and they fully enclosed the cabin, and that house they lived in. Well, years later, Bountiful ended up picking up the home, and when they started taking the home apart, they found this cabin well preserved in it. So the city of Bountiful has it as a historic place that is the cabin in good condition because of it being inside another house. I'm going to go down and we're going to talk about Martin Murphy. There are a few things that are interesting with Martin. Spring of 1893, he spent time working on a ranch, and when he's finishing their hay crop for the year, Major McClure, a civil engineer for the B&M Railroad, came and hired Murphy to go to the southeast corner of Yellowstone Park. The object of the trip was to find a route the railroad could be built over the Continental Divide. He, being part of this party, was gone for 6 weeks and did the surveying that they used to see if they wanted to run a railroad through Yellowstone Park. He tells another story on Christmas Day where they had groups were meeting in Driggs, which is a settlement just 4 miles north of the Murphy Ranch. Some of the people attending the Christmas party when it got later that evening, there was a snowstorm that struck the valley. The Christmas party broke up and everybody went home, started for the homes, but the people on Trail Creek could only get as far as Murphy's Ranch. So they ended up staying at Murphy's Ranch for Christmas. They said the storm was so fierce that 6 families were marooned for 3 days before bobsleds and saddle horses could be obtained so the people could continue the trip into their homes. Winter traveling was hazardous. As I've gone through a lot of these stories in the Gardner family, I'm finding out that winters can be very brutal in Idaho. And we're going to read about some of those, or I'm going to tell you about some of those. One of the other jobs that Murphy had is in 1895, his father started carrying U.S. mail into Jackson Hole country. The mail was carried on horseback until the snow got too deep for a horse to travel. Then father carried the mail on his back on skis a distance of 25 miles. It was a very hazardous route over the Trail Creek summit, where there's lots of snow slides every winter. Fortunately, Mr. Murphy only made one trip over the mountains. And so I guess him seeing what his father had to do was pretty tough. Another person who delivered the mail was Basil Adrian Fossbinder, and he is related through John Williams being the son of James, who had a son James, and then his daughter married Basil. And Basil has the only picture I have is Basil in this plane. It's just a sled that goes on the snow. Here you can see that he delivered mail up in the Bone, Idaho area, and I show that on the map. And this is the contraption that he took a car and put tread on the back, kind of like we see on a tank, and then he made this so he could deliver his mail. So I would like to tell you an article from a local newspaper. They said the mail has always been quite a treat for the Bone residents. It was delivered 3 times a week, summer and winter. The mailman performed many services for the ranchers. He brought letters and packages and freight and took care of cream and took cans of cream back down to the cheese factory. On occasion, he even carried passengers. On one such occasion, in February 1940, a memorable day for Dean and Nellie Elkington. They decided to make a visit from their home in Ammon to the snowbound ranch in Bone, where Reed and Cora were wintering. The most practical way to get there was the mailman. Now, Basil, who traveled the road regularly, had constructed a snowmobile by putting skis under the front wheels of his Model A Ford and building tracks under the back wheels. He sent away for a kit to make it. So the mailman and his passengers, including the 3-year-old Larry Elkington, made themselves comfortable in the tiny cab of the Model A snowmobile and started on a 20-mile trip. You can just imagine Basil, the mailman, this couple with a young child traveling with them as he delivered mail. There was about 15 miles up the road, the snowmobile struck a drift and couldn't go forward and couldn't back out. We were stuck, Nellie said. Mr. Fosbinder had forgotten to bring his shovel, or that's Basil. There was an abandoned cabin about a mile from the road. The travelers left the Ford and walked. The winter was bitter cold, and as we walked, we would sink into the snow knee-deep, Nellie says. Nellie's the one telling this story in the newspaper. They reached the cabin. The men found wood and soon had a fire going in the stove to keep Nellie and Larry warm while the men walked the 5 miles to reach for help. They said they would be back in 3 hours. My, how slow the time went, Nellie says. Larry got hungry, so I searched the old pantry and found a little bit of flour and baking powder and baked him a cake with flour, baking powder, and snow water. It was more than 3 hours before the men returned, and it was well after dark. While walking to the Elkington Ranch, Mr. Fosbinder, Basil, had become unconscious from the cold. Unable to carry him through the drifts and wind, Dean Elkington had put him in a protected grove of trees and went on alone. Elkington told the mailman to stay put, hoping he would understand the warning despite being unconscious. He was soon back with horses to pick up the dangerously cold mailman. Basil had followed his directions and stayed in the trees. His eyes were open and coated with ice. His pulse was slow but still beating. He was stiff as a board. They took him to the ranch, but of course there was no doctor to consult. The ranchers resorted to the same method they used for baby lambs that have gotten chilled. They worked his arms and legs and rubbed them, then put him in a full tub of warm water. He cooled the first tub right off, Dean says. But we kept heating up more wash boilers full of water and pouring them in. After an hour in the tub, Basil started to show some signs of life. They wrapped him in blankets and put him in a bed. Dean Elkington went back out in the snow, took his team and sleigh to get Nellie and Larry. Some 3 hours later, all were safe at the ranch. The next morning, everyone was up bright and early, including Basil. Nellie says his eyes were red as fireballs. You could see some scratches on the eyeball caused by the ice. There was a few water blisters on his feet and ears, and he was fretting about getting the mail delivered. Dean and Reed delivered the mail. Basil finally got to a doctor who explained that the cap he was wearing was thin and the bitter cold wind had numbed his brain, causing unconsciousness. His body had been dressed to withstand the cold, but the cap was summer weight. To this day, I can't look at a letter without appreciating again the friendly, dependable man who delivered it, Nellie says.